Hello everybody, welcome to the IMC's IoT Newsdesk, live from the show floor at CES here in Las Vegas. I'm Jim Morrish, I'm one of the founding partners of a company called Transformer Insights, and I'm here to chat with Sri Ramachandran, who is CTO of Somos. Welcome, Sri.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay, so we were chatting about your overall business proposition. It sounded really interesting, but let's just try and capture a few of the key messages for the listeners, the audience out there. So, firstly, perhaps you can tell me a little bit about what do you think are the challenges of securing IoT devices and deployments?
Thanks, Jim, for kicking off the session with that question. So we are in the IoT infrastructure pavilion, and I'm sure security is top of mind for a lot of people. The classic issues with security in IoT is we tend to apply paradigms that are, kind of worked maybe a decade or 2 decades ago, but don't really have good appeal at this point in time. So we try to think of it in terms of data in motion, data at rest, and apply security network architecture kind of approaches, which is using a single point such as firewalls and so on. Actually, what has happened is that as IoT deployments have scaled, what has happened is that there is no clear perimeter between what is within the enterprise and what is outside, right? So it's become a more amorphous boundary. What is called a perimeter no longer exists. So what you really need is the ability to extend security paradigms across all of those things.
Okay.
And that leads to a lot of challenges for IoT, which is, besides just the actual network security part, there are device security challenges also. So devices need to be identified, devices need to be made sure that they have the right firmware on them. If there is credentialing, then you need to be able to put new credentials, revoke credentials and all of that, and make sure that the security posture of the devices are actually up to date, configurations and so on. So without all of these things being done, we have a plethora of devices out there that are actually being used, whose data is being used to make business decisions, but in fact those devices may have been compromised.
Yes.
And the enterprises have no visibility into that, and that poses a major security challenge at this point.
Actually, it does, and in fact, it's a much wider concept than just security. It's a concept of trust. The data may be secure, and it may be the data that was submitted into the network, but it may not be trustworthy, which is a much wider and more impactful concept. So what are the approaches to improve that concept of trust in IoT devices?
Yeah, that's a good segue into the whole concept of what is today being considered called zero trust. So zero trust is a paradigm where it was originally brought in from the IT world, where they wanted to make sure that every application and every person using the application is authenticated every time they use it. But maybe about several years ago, there was this very famous white hat hacking that was done on a Jeep, on actually a vehicle that was actually in motion, where the hacker got into the Jeep and was able to got into the canvas, got into within the internal systems of the Jeep to actually hack it, to make it do things that was not supposed to happen, right? So what that showed was, once you breach the perimeter of those internal systems, then every internal system trusted each other, right?
Yes.
And so you could then essentially have a Trojan horse go in and actually create havoc within the entire vehicle, within the entire system. And so zero trust is a way to actually say that even within internal systems, you need to be able to authenticate every communication that needs to go on between the two.
Right.
And so the zero trust creates the environment of either you have trust or you don't have trust.
Yeah.
There's nothing intermediate, right? So zero trust is a paradigm to actually make sure that there's either trust or no trust at all. And that's the very key paradigm that actually enables much deeper level of security within IoT deployments.
That's interesting, and you mentioned there one of the things I want to pick up on that you mentioned there is authenticating every transaction and every user. What that comes back to, what that highlights to me is the importance of identity management, and which specific aspects of a potentially broken trust environment does that identity management tackle?
Okay, so there are two things. I think to put it in a very simple way, most IT managers know that you cannot secure what you cannot see, right? So visibility is a very important aspect of that. And what visibility is in the broader sense of devices and so on is the key notion of identity. So identity for IoT devices is actually a pretty big problem, because when you take a typical IoT device, it probably has many identities. So it might have a MAC address or an IMEI put in for the cellular module or for the communication module. The device itself may have a serial number put in by the manufacturer. It may have a SIM card which has its own identifier to enable service. So without that, there's no service being provided by the mobile operator. And above that, you may have an ID put in by the enterprise who wants to manage it because for their particular use case. It's almost like a meta identity that reflects what they're actually using that IoT device for. And so when you have all of these identities, and each of those identities tends to have its own life cycle, right? So a SIM card can be pulled out and a new SIM card plugged in. And so essentially you have a new identification, even though the actual use case and the device itself hasn't changed. So now you got to manage the life cycle of that. And so on. So essentially any one of those IDs can change.
So,
and what the key part of that is how do you aggregate all of that? And how do you still create a unique identity around all of those things, and use these identities as essentially sub-identities or like attributes around that main identity, and still enable the life cycle so that we can expose issues that show the lack of trust in the device, or shows that this particular device has all the right attributes and hence can be trusted.
Yes.
Right. So that's what the identity management does.
Yes, it's clearly an extremely complex situation with as you mentioned, many parallel identifiers with different life cycles, and clearly makes it a very complicated environment. What is it that Somos does in that context? Do you have a proposition in that space?
Yeah, so definitely. So Somos started off. So Somos is a global company. Situated on the east coast of the US, outside New York. And we originally started off providing number administration services. So we are the North American numbering plan administrator. We run the toll-free number registry. And so our basic chops are around numbering identifiers. So we've evolved that into what are called digital identifiers now. And so digital identity management is what the company does.
Right.
And all the associated values around it. So with this, we can actually, we can identify fraudulent telephone calls. We can identify spam calls. We can identify fraudulent IoT devices in the same vein. And we can actually provide trust to an IoT ecosystem that says, okay, can I trust this device or not? Can I trust this population of devices or not? Or how do I know which ones are actually not going to behave properly, so I can take those out of my business decision matrix, so that I can always know that any decision that is being done by my business using these IoT data is actually relevant. It's actually integrated.
Okay, that's a very clever. I mean, it's a clever solution. It sounds like a very important, very important capability, important offering into the space. But what you've described there is kind of device centric. So how can Somos enable the wider the wider IoT ecosystem?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So what we do is, we are an ecosystem player. What we do is we work kind of end to end with all the different players in the device manufacturing ecosystem as well as the device user ecosystem. We kind of call it loosely the supply and demand part of it. So the supply part of it is where there are module manufacturers who actually create the communication module for an IoT device. Then there are device manufacturers who actually put together the actual device that's going to be going through its life cycle. So we actually can work with them to create the right, we call it a Somos ID, but essentially it's a unique identifier for those things. And then on the demand side or the actual usage side, when enterprises or platform providers use it, we can actually track the life cycle of those and then give them the value of, okay, we know this device right from its birth, and we can actually we've been tracking its life cycle, and here's the value that you get, because now you know visibility into the device. You can have a very binary level of trust. You can say, yes, I can trust this, or no, I don't trust this, but here are the actions I need to take so I can actually make it trustable. And this is how I know I can actually create a dashboard to say, okay, these are all the devices that are trustable, not trustable, what my security stance is. And in terms of audit and so on, it provides a very granular approach to saying, okay, what is working and not working within the IoT ecosystem.
Okay, that's an extremely interesting proposition. It's and clearly a very valuable and helpful thing that should help accelerate adoption and make the workings of multiple ecosystems just easier and better, and frankly more trustworthy. And it's trust that matters as enterprises pivot more to cross business, cross company business models that draw data into critical processes. So clearly a very important thing.
Right.
Do you have any final comments before we wrap up? I think we're running out of time a little.
Yeah, so one of the things I want to mention about the ecosystem is that the way we thought about it was we needed to be agnostic to the use case. So this can be applied because it's identity management, and it doesn't matter what type of IoT device it is, right? So we're agnostic to the use case. We also are agnostic to the modality of the network connectivity. So it can be a Wi-Fi connected device, a LoRaWAN device, or a cellular connected device. We're agnostic to that. And so that actually creates a much broader play, which enables us to touch a lot of different parts of the entire IoT ecosystem.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds fascinating. So at that point, I think we're running out of time. I'd like to thank you, Sridhar Ramachandran, CTO of Somos, for some extremely insightful comments there. So thank you for that. And thank you to our audience for joining us.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you all.